Hi, this is Jonathan with Steel Bear Academy. Today we're going to be talking about how to know when you're ready to buy your first gun. So there's a lot of things that go into this, but the first thing you should do is decide, are you ready to buy a gun? Is this something that you want? Is this something that you're ready for? The first question that you should ask yourself is, what are the legal requirements of owning a gun? So I can't give you a specific detailed legal analysis of it, but basically, federally, if you have committed any felonies, if you are, there's a whole litany of lists, but basically if you are a felon or you've got some domestic violence restraining orders type stuff, you've been involuntarily committed to a mental institution, you've been found not guilty by reason of insanity, a whole bunch of other ones, but basically, if you don't fall into any of those categories, and there might be some state-specific ones, so the one about involuntarily committed, that might be a state-specific one that has perhaps a statute of limitations on it. You'll have to figure out that first. So there's a form that you can fill out in California. It's a DOJ form, Department of Justice, and it can tell you if you're legally eligible to own a firearm. Another route you could go is to just attempt to buy a firearm, and if you get denied, then you'll know that you were on the lists of people that couldn't have them, meaning you fell into one of those categories. I don't recommend doing that as a initial preliminary background check for yourself, because when you sign that paper, you're submitting that everything you said on there is true. So you are kind of opening yourself up to some legal penalties and criminal penalties if you lie on that form. So obviously don't lie on that form. Not telling you to do that, but if you don't know, you should figure it out in another way aside from just going for it and seeing what happens. So that's the first step. Figure out if you're legally able to do so. So the next thing I would say is important to figure out if you're ready to buy a firearm is the logistics of the home. So what I mean by that is, are there other people living in your home? Mostly I mean kids. So kids are a big factor in firearms ownership. You want to make sure that your guns are always secured and make sure that the kids never get into them when they're not supposed to. And that's a whole other topic in and of itself, but thinking about those topics are important. Just because you have kids does not mean you should not own a firearm. In some ways, that is actually one of the biggest reasons some people want to own a firearm, is because they want to keep themselves and their family safe. But keeping the kids safe from the firearms is just as important. You also want to think about, this is really more for couples, you want to think about how your spouse feels about firearms, because you're living in a matrimonial or living situation where you're with somebody else, and it may not just be a choice for you specifically. If you're someone who can't own a firearm and you're living with your parents or a guardian or somebody who's, you're living there under their good graces, then you want to think about how this affects them. I wouldn't necessarily say that you should never go ahead and buy one, even if they don't want you to. That's a decision for you to make, but it's definitely something you should think about. There are lots of spouses where one of them is very much against guns and the other one would like to have a gun or might be a little gun curious. So that's something that you'll have to discuss with them. I definitely recommend discussing it. Don't keep it a secret. Discuss it, talk about it, and make sure it's out in the open. You don't want any secrets between you two under any circumstances, in my opinion, but especially not about something as important as guns. So figure that out. As a third kind of aside about that, if you live in a place where you've got people who are not kids and not the spouse, but let's say other people who are coming and going in the home, maybe like a cousin or an uncle or a brother, think about the access that other people have to your home. You also want to think about if you have anybody who is, let's say, mentally impaired in some way or psychologically impaired. I know those words are not really politically correct, but basically somebody who is not of the right mind to be handling firearms, or somebody who has the potential, a higher potential than normal of using that firearm for bad. Those are things to think about. I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy one if that's your living situation, but it's something you should definitely consider and think about. The whole thing about this is you need to reason everything out. You need to think about everything. You need to have everything at least evaluated in your life before you make a big decision, as you should always. But guns are no different. Guns are life and death tools. Every time you handle a firearm, you're making life and death choices. So you need to give the situation that gravity. Doesn't mean that you should be necessarily scared, but it's healthy to have a certain level of caution and a certain level of, being responsible to know the potential dangers that firearms present. So that's rule number 2, or that's the thing you should look at second. Third thing I think you should look at is your own personal maturity. So aside from the logistics of the law and whether or not you can own one in your home based on the people and your situation, you should really think about your own level of maturity. Now, I know that everybody thinks that they're the most mature person in the world, but you really got to think about how would I be as a person who owns a gun? Think about how you are with other important things in your life. Are you somebody who owns a car? When you drive, are you the type of person who gets into arguments with people or road rages or has a hard time controlling their temper? Those things are things you should very much consider thinking about in terms of why you should get help for those things if you need some. There's no reason that you should think those things are permanent features of your personality. Those are things you can change. They're things you have control over. But you want to make sure that you are mature enough to handle the responsibility of owning a firearm. And part of that maturity is knowing if you should not. So if you're somebody who if you don't feel like you can keep yourself dispassionate, if you can keep yourself, level-headed under stress, that kind of thing, then that's important to know. It's important to know for yourself and for everybody else. If you don't think you can handle that level of responsibility, then a firearm is not for you. You have other choices of self-defense. I have a couple things on the table to show you, but really have a deep conversation, a very honest, deep conversation with yourself about your own maturity level. That's something that's very important to do as well. The next thing I think you should think about is, let's say you're not against it, but you are not sure how to justify it in your mind or how to wrap your mind around this new concept of yourself. Because when you buy a firearm, you are still the same person. However, something about you changes. You take a different level of responsibility for yourself. So this is something important that I think most firearms owners have this conversation with themselves or think about. You want to think about what the purpose of the firearm is. So for most people, the first thing they think about is self-defense or self-preservation or safety. That's the first thing their mind goes to. I want to buy a gun for personal protection to keep me safe. And that's a very good rationale, because you're deciding from the get-go what you want your guns for. It's a considered choice. You're buying it for a purpose. You don't want to have the purpose be that you want to feel powerful. That is not the right mentality to have about it. There are lots of other ways that you can feel powerful. Many of them are not healthy, meaning not a good idea. You don't want to go feel powerful by yelling at the clerk at the store or beating somebody up on the street. Those are not good ways to feel powerful, because they hurt other people. Firearms, you have to be careful that you don't get into them for the wrong reasons of thinking that it's going to make you feel powerful. it's not the right way to look at it. You should think of it as empowering yourself, but not using the power to hurt somebody else or to have power over somebody else. That's not what it should be about. Self-preservation, that's self-defense, self-preservation. Those are all about you keeping yourself safe from those who want to do you harm. It's not about you harming somebody else. And people who are gun owners, they don't envision themselves like, gosh, they can't wait to hurt somebody. That's not how most gun owners think. Vast majority of them, 99.9%. It's the ones who feel that they want to hurt somebody to prove themselves powerful. Those are the people who should not own guns. Getting back to self-preservation, if you're not quite sure about, this is a common thing a lot of people go through is, I want to protect myself, but I don't want to hurt anybody. Nobody wants to hurt anybody who is a good person who has empathy, and people don't want to hurt people. Gun owners who defend themselves don't usually want to hurt anybody. It's a self-defense is a matter of a person attacked them and they want to keep themselves safe, so they use the firearm to stop the attacker. That's a different mentality than hurting the other person. They don't care about hurting the other person. They want to stop the other person. So if you're somebody who has not had this, who hasn't had the realization about that yet, I'd like to give you a little exercise to think about it. Here's kind of a little thought experiment. If I was in the parking lot of the grocery store and I'm walking to my car and there's a white windowless van next to my car, and I'm walking up to my car and I'm about to put my groceries in the back seat or in the trunk, and somebody busts out of the van and runs over to me with a ski mask on and tries to kidnap me. They try to grab my arms and pull me into the van. How am I going to respond? Meaning you. How are you going to respond to that? Now, if you've got any amount of training about it, you'll probably be going through your mind of like, well, I'd, pull the guy's hand off my wrist and punch him in the face, or go for a takedown, or any of those things. And those are great. That's a good mentality to have. But if you don't have that kind of training, then you might be hard pressed to think of, how am I going to protect myself? I might scream, I might, kick and close my eyes and, punch them and that kind of thing. But if I change the scenario and I say, imagine that you're walking with somebody who's important to you. Somebody like a child, your spouse, your niece or nephew, your grandma, your parent, somebody who you are kind of in their protection, if that makes sense. Now let's play that same scenario, but now instead, when you go up to that van, somebody busts out of the van and they try to take your loved one. Now how are you going to react? Well, most people will respond by saying something like, I'm going to kill the motherfucker, right? I'm going to rip his goddamn throat out and kill him, right? People have a much more powerful response to somebody who's in their charge that they're protecting, as opposed to protecting themselves necessarily. It's called the Bodyguard Phenomenon, and it's just something to think about in terms of your own potential warrior spirit within you. I say warrior spirit meaning your ability to keep yourself safe through violent action, let's say. That you're willing to stand up to adversity, stand up to somebody trying to hurt you, and especially stand up to someone trying to hurt someone who's in your care or your charge. That can help you refocus your mind on whether or not you've got the mindset to own a firearm. Because the gun by itself does not do anything. It's just an inanimate tool like a knife or a flashlight, a pen. A pen does not write the great stories of the world. A pen is just a tool that lets you write. It's the human behind the pen who makes the great stories of the world, who does the actions, who puts the effort in. A gun is the same way. A gun is not what makes a police officer able to save people. The police officer is the one who saves people, and sometimes they use a firearm to do that. A firearm is not, it doesn't have any, like, there's nothing intelligent about it. It doesn't have the ability to discern anything. All it does is do what you tell it to do, much like a car. A car doesn't go out there to try to run people over, and it doesn't go out there to get you from place to place. You're the one who does that. So a firearm is only as strong or is only as useful as the person who's using it. So if you haven't decided that you're going to be willing to take the responsibility of keeping yourself and your loved one safe, well, then unfortunately a firearm might not be useful for you. I would say many people who think they can't actually could, given the right scenario, but they haven't put themselves in that scenario, and God hope they never have to. But a lot of people who don't perceive themselves as, oh, I could never pull the trigger. I'd only want to scare them off, hold them at gunpoint, and I would never pull the trigger on a human. There's a common thing pacifists say, right? And it really comes from empathy. You don't want to hurt anybody. None of us want to hurt anybody. That is not what this is about. This is about keeping yourself safe. And if somebody else who's trying to hurt you will not stop unless they get hurt themselves, well, that's you keeping yourself safe. That's you being kind to yourself and living up to your own responsibilities to keep yourself or your loved ones safe. So, if you are not quite sure about whether or not you could engage in the act of self-defense of keeping yourself safe, think about that bodyguard. Think about that bodyguard scenario. Keeping yourself, what would you do, versus keeping somebody you love safe. So that's something to think about. As kind of a final thing to think about is the cost. So firearms are a fairly expensive activity. There are certainly more expensive activities, but they're not free to do. Shooting firearms is not a free activity. And if you invest more money into it in terms of practice and time, you'll get more out of it. Just like, if you want to go learn how to play basketball, buying the basketball is the first step. But it doesn't make you good just to buy the best basketball or to buy the best hoop. You've got to practice, right? You got to make sure that you put in the time to get good with it. There are other options of defensive tools. So I have a couple on the table here. One is a flashlight. This is a fairly bright one. A flashlight is an incredibly useful tool for deterring attackers or deterring people who want to cause you harm. People generally don't want to be seen when they're doing a bad thing, when they're trying to hurt somebody, when they're trying to break into a home, etc. The use of light can very much help keep your home safe from people who try to break into it. It can very much keep you safe in the dark alleys at night. Light is a very useful tool to have. That is an often overlooked aspect of self-defense. People talk about self-defense, they think the gun, and they think martial arts, they think the knife, deadly instruments, or potential ways to hurt somebody. But self-defense is all about keeping yourself safe by any means. So it's all about, the first step is avoidance, avoiding the problem. If you never have to use the firearm, that is best. If you never have to use the knife, the pepper spray, your fists, etc., you've done good. That's self-defense right there. So the flashlight, useful. A knife is another deadly weapon. It is essentially in the same category as a firearm, legally, in terms of your ability to use it under certain circumstances to protect yourself. A knife can be useful to have. It's a very potent, close quarters, very close distances weapon. But a knife it's very easy to get yourself into some very dangerous situations with a knife. If you think that this is your defensive tool. It's better than your fists, especially because it gives you a little bit of extra range. You know, the maximum range that I have with my fists is not as big as the maximum range I have with even a short knife like this. And especially the cutting power of a knife really amplifies the power it has over just the blunt power of strikes with your hands or your feet. But a knife requires at least some amount of training to be good with, and a lot of training to really be good with. So don't think that just because you have a knife, you're somehow safe or something. A knife can very easily be used against you, and knife fights are very, very ugly. You do not want to get in a knife-on-knife fight if you can avoid it. A firearm is something that gives you the power of range. So when you have a firearm, you have the ability to use it to shoot somebody farther away than what you can touch them with a knife. Maximum range of this 1911 in 45 ACP is quite a bit longer than the maximum range of this extra bit of blade. And the effort required to inflict the amount of damage and the amount of pain on the attacker with a firearm is vastly reduced. So the amount of effort that I have to do is to just pull the trigger. Now it fires a shot. That's incredibly effective for the amount of effort that I put in. The knife also is effective. It provides a level of it provides a higher level of effectiveness for my effort than my fists, for example. It takes a lot of effort to hurt somebody with your fists. To stop somebody with a knife is less effort because of the cutting surface of the blade helps to amplify the amount of damage you can cause based on the effort, if that makes sense. Even a light, this is how much effort it takes to turn the light on. Just a press of the thumb. Don't underestimate the power of a strobe. It can be very useful. A light in a defensive encounter can be very helpful, especially on a firearm. If this was somehow attached to the firearm as a weapon-mounted light, we talked about that before, but illumination is very disorienting towards somebody, right? It can make somebody lose their visual acuity for moments, and that can be enough to self-defense, to protect yourself. So don't underestimate, if you are not somebody who has made the decision based on that criteria of being able to own a firearm, don't feel like that precludes you from keeping yourself safe. There are other options: lights, knives, blunt instruments, even just impromptu blunt instruments that you find. A pen can serve as a defensive tool if you know how to use it. Pepper spray, very effective based on the effort you exert. All you have to do is, push the plunger on the back, and it sprays out a stream of very annoying, very unpleasant concoction into the air. So that can be another useful tool. So this has just been a discussion about, think about some things before you buy a firearm. Nobody is ever truly ready to buy a firearm, I don't think. When they are deciding they're going to do it, it's more like their mind is saying, I don't know if this is going to be, I don't know if I know everything yet, but I'm going to take the plunge, I'm going to make the jump, I'm going to do it anyway because it's important to me. So if you're in that boat, I welcome you to seek out some training from us. This is Steel Bear Academy. I'm Jonathan. You can reach me at steelbearacademy.com. Give us a call. I'd be happy to help you. Thank you so much for listening, guys. And until next time, stay safe. Have a good night. Bye-bye.